The view screen was a chaotic smear of static and strobe light flashes as the Iron Talon's engines screamed at 110% capacity. Kalen's hands were white-knuckled on the manual overrides, the metal beneath his palms vibrating with a frequency that threatened to shake his teeth loose. He didn't look at the escape pod readings or the frantic telemetry from the civilian convoy. He only watched the prow of his dying ship, a jagged needle of steel, as it aimed directly into the pulsing, bioluminescent heart of the infected blight carrier. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a human decides that impossible is just a suggestion, you'll want to see how this ends. Subscribe to join our journey through the stars. Now, let's look at how a simple patrol officer ended up holding the fate of an empire in his hands. 11 days earlier, the Aegis 7's carbon scrubbers had failed for the 4th time in a standard month. Kalen Vance sat on a low crate in the machine shop, his focus narrowed to the rhythmic motion of a standard-issue cleaning rag against the barrel of his pulse rifle. The cloth was stained with grease and carbon scored from 100 range sessions, a humble, fraying bit of fabric that felt honest in a galaxy that was rapidly becoming anything but. Around him, the ship hummed with the familiar, weary song of a vessel past its prime, a stark contrast to the sharp, sudden silence that fell over the deck when the airlock cycled. Mara Thorne didn't belong on a ship that smelled of recycled sweat and ozone. She wore the deep violet silks of the Aurelian hegemony, her movements possessing a fluid, predatory grace that made the Aegis crew look like stumbling children. She held a data spike sealed with the Empress's own solar crest, its golden light reflecting in her cold, multifaceted eyes. The summons didn't come from high command. It came from the throne of a sun god. Commander Jint's office was a cramped box that felt even smaller with the Imperial envoy standing in the corner like a statue made of glass and shadow. Jin didn't look at the summons. He looked at Kalen, his eyes searching for the man who had supposedly disappeared into a routine patrol 5 years ago. "They're asking for the ghost of Helios," Jin said, his voice a low rasp. Kalen didn't flinch. He just kept his eyes on the scarred surface of the commander's desk. "I'm a technician, sir. I fix scrubbers and buff rifles." "You rammed a capital ship, Vance." Jin leaned forward, the light from the summons casting long shadows across his face. "The Aurelians don't forget a debt, and apparently someone on those civilian ships was worth more than a dozen star systems. The Empress wants to see the man who turned his ship into a hammer." Panic rippled through the Aegis 7 like a hull breach. Humans didn't get invited to the eternal dawn. We were the newcomers, the scavengers of the outer rim, the species that the 47 established races tolerated only because we were too stubborn to die out. To be summoned by Empress Solara was to be called before a living star. Kalen felt the weight of the cleaning rag in his pocket, a small anchor of reality. He thought of the Helios Gate, the way the blight had looked like a crawling ink stain across the stars, and the way the civilian ships had looked so small, so fragile. "I didn't save them because they were important. I saved them because they were breathing." He stood up, his posture shifting from a weary mechanic to something harder, something forged in the heat of a dying reactor. The transition was subtle, but Mara Thorne noticed. She tilted her head, her gaze locking onto the human who seemed entirely unimpressed by the weight of an imperial mandate. "Have you ever had a moment where a single choice you made years ago suddenly came back to change everything you thought you knew about your life?" The Aegis 7 felt different as Kalen walked toward the docking umbilical. The crew, usually loud and cynical, stood in a silent corridor. They didn't cheer, not yet. They watched with a mixture of awe and terror, realizing that one of their own was being pulled into a world of gods. The transition to the Imperial shuttle was a blur of sterile white corridors and the humming of gravity plates that felt far too smooth. Kalen sat in a recessed chair, his fingers tracing the rough texture of the cleaning rag tucked into his belt. It was the only thing in this pressurized cabin that felt real. The Eternal Dawn was not a ship so much as a captured star wrapped in layers of obsidian and gold. As the shuttle entered the throne room, the walls dissolved into a panoramic star map of the entire hegemony. It was a spherical chamber, making Kalen feel as though he were floating in the center of a galaxy. At the far end, seated upon a spire of crystalline light, was Empress Solara. Commander Jin had been right about the weight of her gaze. It didn't just see him, it measured the atomic density of his soul. "Step forward, human," the Empress commanded. Her voice didn't travel through the air. It resonated directly in the bone. Kalen walked. His boots, scuffed from years of grease monkey labor, made a dull thud against the polished floor. He stopped 10 paces from the spire. Behind the Empress stood a younger woman, her features hidden in shadow, but her posture was familiar. "You are Kalen Vance," Solara said, her eyes like dying Novi. "The man who threw away a Tier 4 patrol vessel to stop a blight carrier. My advisors called it a tactical waste. They said a human ship was a pittance compared to the cost of the infection spreading." Kalen cleared his throat. "I wasn't thinking about the cost of the ship, Majesty." "I know what you were thinking," she interrupted. The star map shifted, zooming into a grainy recording of the Helios Gate. "You were thinking of the 3 civilian transports pinned against the gravity well. One of those ships, the Lumina, carried a cargo my empire could not afford to lose." The shadowed woman stepped forward into the light. It was the Archduchess Lyra. She wasn't dressed in silk, but in the simple, singed flight suit of a medical officer. She looked at Kalen not with imperial distance, but with the raw, haunting recognition of someone who had watched their savior through a viewport. "My daughter was on that ship, Kalen Vance," the Empress whispered, "performing a rite of service among the commoners. You didn't just save a convoy. You saved the bloodline of the sun." Solara rose from her throne. In her hands appeared a pulsing, amber sphere that seemed to contain a miniature solar flare. The solar core. It was a relic of sacrifice, an artifact legend said was only given to those who had given everything. "In a galaxy of 47 species," the Empress declared, her voice rising to fill the sphere, "only the humans turn their dying ships into hammers, and only a human would expect nothing in return." She descended the spire, the court around them dropping to their knees in a wave of shimmering fabric. For the first time in 10,000 years, the imperial court knelt to an outsider. Solara held out the core. Kalen reached out, his calloused, grease-stained fingers trembling as they closed around the warm glass. The power humming within it was immense, but it felt strangely like the heat of the Iron Talon's engines just before the end. Later, as he walked back toward the transport that would take him back to the Aegis 7, Kalen pulled the cleaning rag from his pocket. It was a dirty, humble thing. Carefully, he wrapped the priceless, glowing solar core in the fraying cloth, protecting the ultimate light with the most basic tool of his trade. He wasn't just a technician anymore. He was the bridge. The rag was no longer just for buffing rifles. It was the shroud for a new era. What would you be willing to sacrifice if you knew that no one, and yet everyone, was watching? Our story may be over, but the alliance is just beginning. We'll see you tomorrow for the next chronicle.